Outsiders number 24. Welcome to Outsiders number 24, a podcast for the end of Western civilization. And today I want to talk about a very sad topic, unfortunately, but very necessary in this whole framework of how are sex and power used, or how is sex used to keep us disempowered and keep us unhappy and unfree and unable to meet our needs and less happy as a result. This is number 5 in the 7 essay series of sex and power. And this is called The Breaking of Children. In order to reverse the damage done to our authentic selves, we must understand how that damage is inflicted. This brings us to the horrific topic of child abuse. I'm going to say something that's very provocative that many people may disagree with, but stick with me and listen to why I'm saying what I'm saying. Our society is based on child abuse. Our society is based on child abuse. It would not function without child abuse. This kind of abuse that I'm talking about isn't just the drunken father coming home and beating his children, but includes all the forms of violence listed earlier, often enforced with soft tones and cooing voices. Our violence-based civilization cannot exist if children's wills are not broken, their feelings repressed, and their true selves virtually annihilated from a very young age. It must be about the propagandized greater good and not what the child feels, needs, and wants if children are to be raised to continue to be compliant slaves in a world that runs based on obedience, emotional ignorance, domination, inequality, violence, fear, and scarcity. The good news is that over time, we seem to have accepted less and less direct slavery and oppression, if not outright genocide, of less powerful populations as well as women. We can only hope and work so that the last truly helpless minority, children, will find a world of kindness, love, and acceptance in the near future. If that happens, the cycle of oppression will be broken and we may finally have a world of freedom and pleasure. How are children abused and why? Of course, parents try and they believe they are trying to protect their children, but they can only do so within the paradigms and perspectives that they can see. There are a few things in the world that are physically dangerous for children and must be met with some degree of force, insistence, or intensity. So if a child's going to touch a hot stove, you may have to yell to stop that. If the house is on fire, you may have to scream or grab a child. If that child is walking in front of traffic, you may need to yell or scream or run and grab them. This, of course, isn't violence. This is protection. And so the question is, where does the protection end? When does the line of protection end? And where does it actually become violence? Therefore, most of what parents are yelling, screaming, hitting, or using shame, blame, guilt, other punishments, and rewards to manage are societal standards, like not being naked where it's not condoned, limits around living structures. We all live in tiny boxes in cramped cities, and that makes it uncomfortable for others if children are running around or screaming. Or pure illogical conditioned obedience, forcing them to pledge allegiance to a flag, praying to a god they've never seen, or registering for a draft to die in a war that has nothing to do with them, for example. On the other side of the coin, and much more insidious, is neglect. Children are ignored and their needs are invalidated, not through action, but instead through inaction. This may include the basics of food, clothing, and shelter, but we have many rich, poor children in our world as well who've had all the comforts and even luxuries of life, but who've received no empathy, mirroring, or emotional validation, and are just as lost and depressed as adults as those who are more obviously abused. Many of them ostensibly enter life with everything, but are unable to connect with others, form meaningful relationships, or get their needs met. In other words, they lack effective ways to exercise their power and volition in the world. Neither of these is worse or better forms of abuse. The degree of damage to the child's true self will be determined by the experience the child has with the particular trauma the child endures. There's some evidence that more sensitive children may have a more challenging time than some of their peers. Perhaps no life can ever be completely void of emotional trauma. There will be emotions and experiences in every childhood that the child cannot yet understand or process, and must delay processing until they're prepared to do so. Trauma. Just a little side note to trauma. Trauma is something that makes a permanent change in the function of something. In other words, if you have a trauma ward at a hospital and you have a bullet wound, then the bullet has traumatized the body. In other words, the body was not able to handle the energy of the bullet, and so tissues and organs have been compromised in their function until they're able to heal. And that's how we define trauma in a medical sense. Now, the same thing happens emotionally and psychologically. You have emotional impacts to your psyche as a child, and if you're not able to process those and spring back to normal form and healthy form, just like you go like this, there's no trauma because my skin immediately bounces back to where it was, right? But if there's a wound, then it cannot do that. Same thing with emotional trauma. If the processing and decision making is malformed by the intensity of the experience, and these are created numerously from circumcision all the way until forcing people to get student loans in hundreds of ways in our society, from little until very big. Once those traumas exist, until they are processed and released, they will continue to influence the actions and behaviors of that person in ways that are, let's say, malformed, or not the normal, natural ways in which they would resolve problems and seek solutions and seek to meet their needs. In a healthy society, there is space made for each member of the community to process these traumas, feel what needs to be felt, release the emotional energy of the experience, and continue life with a clean slate, instead of carrying old wounds and pain to get triggered with each new relationship, crisis, or difficult event. Because you've never seen this, and you probably don't know what I'm talking about, for example, they have specific massages that the young people get in Hawaiian cultures, kahuna massages and other things, and they say these massages last for days and they get touched by every member of the community. And the point is, we're going to rub your trauma out, rub your pain out, because the issues, the traumas, actually exist in the body in crystalline form. Body electronics, talks about this. It was a great healing system, and explains how actual physical crystalline forms develop in the body that actually stop the body's energy from flowing. The chi or ki or prana is not flowing at that point, and that prevents the body and emotional and psychological responses from responding appropriately to painful, difficult events. Why do some of us fight, fly, or freeze, fight, run, or flee when something comes at us that we're not prepared to deal with? It's because of these traumas and these energetic responses and these crystalline blocks in our energy fields. So if a society is dancing and singing and moving and celebrating, they have processes built into their society that allow them to process and release traumas, pain, discomforts in ways that help them get back to a neutral state and resolve the trauma. We don't do that. We don't touch young people, especially teenagers, especially in America. And we don't provide contact. We don't provide methods for them to move through and heal emotional issues. If they're moving in sports teams, it's about getting a ball over a line. It's about getting a ball into a net. It's not about moving the body in ways that will perform healing, such as yoga, qigong. All these things are made to optimize the flow of energy in the body, right? And so these tribal and native societies have them built in, and of course we exercise them and get rid of them. And if some people can enjoy dancing or movement, as I said before, people will sign up for specific types of dancing, vigorous Latin dances, and they'll not need therapy anymore because they'll be processing through that. But in general, we don't do that. So our society doesn't do that. Most conventional forms of psychoanalysis that are practiced are usually useless in supporting emotional healing cycles and reestablishing emotional health. Just sitting there and talking has a limited effect on the psyche and healing. Because if you understood and could talk about why you have traumas or what the issues are, then you wouldn't have them. The point is they're unconscious, these damages, as opposed to physical trauma. You will not be aware of them and how they're changing your thinking patterns and your decisions. As a result, we have an entire civilization made up of adult children using violence to get what they want, blaming others for their problems, attacking their former beloveds after breakups and divorces, acting out sexually in compulsion and not freedom, clinging to money and property, often to a degree that far exceeds the reality of the issues involved, becoming entangled in costly lawsuits and legal disputes, creating armies to go punish the bad guys over there, and demanding better politicians to serve as mommies and daddies and make everything okay, developing mental illnesses for attention or to withdraw from it all, performing superstitious rituals to get the favor of their preferred gods, using drugs, both legal and illegal, to suppress their pain and their emotional distress, becoming engrossed in sports or shopping or gambling or eating disorders or religion or anything else for the same reasons, and in general using incredibly illogical and ineffective strategies to get their needs met. All right. Wow. And until we seek and find healing or are compelled to do so by circumstances, all of these continue. So part of the blindness that Neo understands, remember, his body is in stasis. He can't move. He's in goo. He doesn't feel it. He's being fed things, but he can't act. And until he realizes, hey, I'm in the goo, until we realize, hey, the way I'm responding isn't healthy or helping me meet my needs, we can never get it healed. And if we just go to talk therapy for it, often that will be insufficient, speaking from my personal experience. The new family. You may think that the traditional nuclear family is something that has been around as a stable unit of society for thousands of years. This is not true. The nuclear family is a marketing strategy that has only existed since shortly after the First World War. Before that, family clans tended to live at fairly close quarters. Parents lived with grandparents and often the extended family, aunts and uncles. The concept that a mother and father live alone together in a house or apartment surrounded by strangers is new, and actually is just over 100-year experiment that we're reaping the results of now. While there may have been some additional freedom from entangling and perhaps abusive family relationships through this, there's also been a terrible cost. Just as multiple sticks burn brighter together, a couple alone has far fewer emotional and physical resources to ensure their needs are met once they are separated from the rest of the community and the society. Even more important for purposes of our current discussion, instead of having a wealth of different age groups, experience levels, viewpoints, perspectives, and people who love them, the nuclear family reduces the people who can effectively care for and help children to meet their needs to just 2. Even if the family is healthy, which is extremely unlikely, illness or death of one caregiver immediately reduces the emotional and often the financial resources that can be dedicated to supporting the children by 50% or more. This is an extremely precarious and unnecessary situation to put children in, the most valuable future of society. Whatever the dangers of abuse or neglect that can happen where there's adequate parental support for children, if both parents aren't home or are completely exhausted from breadwinning, the children's needs will be met even less. This can be even worse for a single parent situation. The result is the society we see now, with all of the problems, issues, homelessness, drug abuse, poverty, and all the other responses to violence that we're experiencing. It's clear that the death of what little community we still possessed, because we used to be in tribes before we were in clans, in the past has put the current generation at serious risk, and yet few people are considering the obvious solutions of bringing more people together to support each other for mutual support and community, and to meet children's needs more effectively, which to me is only logical. When people do choose this, all of the issues previously, violence is the primary problem-solving and relating tool, the lack of other relating and communication skills, and emotional immaturity rear their ugly heads, and most of those who decide to create intentional communities never even get them started for these reasons. Those who do create some kind of shared space often split up after a brief time. In addition, all the shame and judgment and blame that is the bedrock of society makes it hard to consider any alternative relationship structures in these communities. Just like I'm talking about in this book, you can't even think about or consider, oh, well, should we manage our sexuality differently or our relationships differently because of all of the programming that we already have? And we also grab the tools of violence, shame, blame, guilt, threat, punishment when we try to create a community because we don't know how to use other tools with others. And that just destroys the relationships and the community implodes almost always. And so community remains a fantastic but too challenging strategy for most people who want to improve their own happiness and the quality of attention and support for their offspring. Ownership, property, and children. In very few places does any kind of stewardship or mutual support mentality still exist in the world. In other words, when we see our neighbors' kids running wild, we don't go take care of them and give them what they need. We just complain or look at them and wag our fingers, right? Clever strategies and outright brutality have been used to eliminate traditional methods for keeping society together by sharing access to resources. Again, we have all the financial challenges and how do you live with people that you like without a lot of money. You know, your neighborhood is chosen a lot because of your socioeconomic status, because of your job and your requirements for trying to work on a meager existence, and not because you want to be with these people, and trying to do that is more costly and difficult, at least at the beginning. This applies especially to land. The new scarcity and ownership doctrines that have been propagated both by indoctrination and force make it difficult to maintain or rebuild the kinds of communities that have existed for thousands of years. Starting with things like the Enclosure Acts, where they just took away people's lands in Great Britain and gave them to the nobles. The tribal world started to be destroyed, and once people could no longer feed themselves, they were forced to go to the cities and work for the corporations and the industries that were creating what was needed for the new industrial society, and thus society was broken. Note that indigenous communities existed for all that time without all the necessities our present society accepts as normal. No prisons, police, armies, taxes, complex legal systems, and so on. So successful has our indoctrination been that to suggest that we enjoy an ordered society without those things sounds ludicrous to most of us. In fact, all of those things in their current forms only exist to hold the current power structures in place. As is becoming more evident every year, they were not created to protect the citizenry nor their rights, which is why we have all of the protests going on about these things. With ownership of land came ownership of people. Marriage was initially a property arrangement where a father sold his daughter into the possession of another man. In many places in the world, the desires and consent of the woman being sold into this new form of slavery are still irrelevant. Children are still owned by their parents in the Western world, and is still seen fit to punish them when they don't obey, send them and force them to state schools for their own good, and in general, completely ignore their desires, wants, and needs. Although the parents don't see this, they don't understand that what they're doing is just using violence to enforce their will upon their children, trying to get security for them, but keeping them from meeting so many of their needs. If that sounds correct to you, consider that it was not many years not many years ago, it was common to speak of the necessity for husbands to punish their wives for inappropriate behavior. I'm hoping that someday soon it will be just as crazy if we talk about punishing children as it does to say now you need to punish your wife to keep her in line. You cannot have a loving relationship with someone you feel a duty to police, or someone whose behavior you feel a duty to police. I'm sorry this is so dark, but again, this is the reality of the world we live in. The next chapter heading is called Teaching Children to Hate Themselves. Because of the massive energy it takes to keep those who know they are free from escaping and meeting their needs as they see fit, religion and parents spend massive energy shaming and guilting children into morally acceptable behaviors and repressing their natural feelings, questions, and desires until that shame becomes internalized. Once mommy's voice rings inside your head every time you start to touch yourself down there and you feel bad, mommy doesn't need to tell you to do that anymore. You've developed your own internal policeman. Then shame and guilt-based action is praised. What a good girl, boy you are, driving the true self and its desires further and further into the shadows, and to get the approval and attention from your caregivers and the rest of society, until all of the horrible results I previously described become commonplace. In fact, our current media preoccupation with zombies might be due to the fact that most of us are zombies, moving through life on a pre-programmed path with no thought about how we really feel or what we really want, and taking no creative, sustained effort to meet our needs or achieve our goals. In fact, those who do meet with incredible success precisely because there are so few of us who are able to do that. Marshall Rosenberg calls most of us nice dead people. Yes, we fit into society, but inside of us is a whole kaleidoscopic world of goals and visions and dreams, offerings, and magical powers that goes untouched, unaccessed, and unoffered, and we are all the poorer for it. Zombies pass on and enforce their deadness in the next generation. And that will continue until we decide to change things, or until everything collapses. So how do we change things and save the children of today? Is learning effective parenting and nonviolence enough? That is a good question. Why can't we just offer parents more effective parenting techniques, tell them all of what is contained here, and then poof, child raising will be improved? Unfortunately, it isn't that easy. If parents are raising children without access to their own inner emotional landscape, they have no map for interacting with children except through violence and the pre-programmed rules of the society they live in. They have only what they've been taught and programmed with to work with. Authentic relating requires both sides of an interaction to be aware of their own feelings and needs. And I work with people every week who have very little connection to either. They can't tell me what they're feeling. They can't tell me what they need. And therefore, how are they supposed to have relationships with other people if they don't even have a relationship with themselves and their bodies? Instead of real relating, most parents trying to be better just switch to a better set of rules. In other words, they'll find another book and they'll use that idea, or they'll find another person telling them how to raise their children, and they'll start to implement these concepts instead of being feeling into, as I said in the very first chapters, their own intuition, their own knowing and truth, and their own feelings, and being able to act from there. Learning to have equal and rewarding relationships with children requires the same skills, emotional fluency, understanding, and acceptance as learning to have rewarding relationships with anyone. And if these damaged parents try to parent, get another set of rules. Oh, I forgot a little set here, little thing. If they're parenting with the rules that they've learned from society, and then these damaged parents try to parent without any fixed rules at all, and yet they have no access to their internal knowing, they end up becoming passive doormats. So they're either violent disciplinarians or passive doormats who are, we don't want to damage the children. But if they don't have an honest emotional experience and expression of themselves, then they don't know how to respond or react or engage with anyone, much less their children. So if I say stop being violent to your children, that doesn't help them at all, and they can't parent any differently. They can only parent according to the robotic schemas that they've been given, which may be, again, somewhere between defensive violence and permissiveness, but provide no true real relationships and connection. Okay, and learning to have these equal and rewarding relationships with children requires the same skills, emotional fluency, understanding, and acceptance as learning to have rewarding relationships with anyone, as I said before. Until a parent has resolved their own emotional issues and healed their own inner child and set him or her free, they will continue to either use the toolkit of violence or withdraw and let the child do what they want, which won't meet their needs or the child's. Only once the adult has the emotional fluency and the access to the understanding of power and volition and how to use them that goes with it to get their needs met in the world can they begin to empathize with their children and partner effectively in getting the children's needs met. What can we do? The voices that have been raised against child abuse through the ages, from Freud to Elisa Miller, have been silenced, attacked, and ostracized. And I can go deeply into that in probably another podcast. It takes great courage to stand up when children are being abused. It takes perhaps even more courage to heal one's own inner child and learn to manage the power that comes from being a healed human being. The first way to truly help children be happy and get their needs met is to develop intimacy with our own emotions and learn to get our own needs met. Yes, people who've stood up for these things have met either character assassination, literal assassination, akin to MLK and others. Wilhelm Reich, Freud first saw that sexual abuse was rampant in Vienna at the turn of the century. And when he started mentioning this, they said, well, if you keep talking about that and accusing the powerful men in our society of raping and sexually abusing their daughters, then we are going to shut you down and take your license away. And, well, we're going to shut down your movement and maybe kill you. So that conversation is not written down anywhere, but when you see how Freud began and the things he was saying, and then he suddenly changed his entire theory to say, oh, well, this is repressed just fantasies and penis envy and dad wanting to be like the parents, and created that psychological bullshit and nonsense, which we still kept till the current day. We got rid of all the truth that he'd found in the fact that, yes, child abuse is how we run society. And at that point, extreme sexual abuse of children and girls in order to keep society in line and in order to somehow meet the needs of men that, again, that were disconnected from their own emotions, and those programmed zombies walking around. And so the whole thing is just one cascading catastrophe of destruction in child raising, in generation after generation, disconnected from their own emotional fluency and competence in a society where things that would be considered incredibly irrational, dangerous, or even insane, to the degree of selfishness that we encourage and so-called individuality and abuse, become the standard and rampant. And unless we learn to heal this, we cannot move forward in our power to have pleasure, to get our needs met, to be happy, and to have freedom in the world. All right, thank you. I wish this wasn't quite as dark as it is, but this is the topic, and it is tragic and sad, and I hope we can move forward together to do something to shift the world in the future.